In addition to recalling real events, it's also possible to create experiences that subjectively resemble memory recalls, but in reality never took place. And the cortical areas active when remembering are very similar to those active when we're imagining something. So let's see how this works in the high-level cortical model. Suppose you are asked to imagine having a picnic on a beach next to a lake with Albert Einstein and Picasso, not something you've ever done. You've heard some words. Hearing each word results in indirect activations of columns in the discriminates visual objects area, for example. The words picnic and lake are familiar and result in strong active column populations in this area. Outputs from the discriminates visual objects area populations are synchronized and therefore released to the discriminates groups of objects area, where they result in a level of activity. You've probably been to a picnic on a lake in the past, so there's a reasonably strong activation. This activity at the groups of objects level is prolonged, and activity in the discriminates visual objects area indirectly activated by hearing Einstein and Picasso. Outputs from the new discriminates visual objects area populations, corresponding with mental images of the two people, are again released to the discriminates groups of objects area, where they result in a level of activity. However, because the juxtaposition of Einstein and Picasso is unusual, there's a relatively low activity at this level of complexity. So receptive field expansion occurs to bring the number of receptive field detections up to the minimum level. Activity of the two populations in the discriminates groups of objects area is prolonged, then their outputs are released to the group of groups level. In the group of groups level, there's a degree of receptive field detection. But because nothing like this has ever taken place, there's a relatively low level of activity at this level of complexity. So again, there's a fair amount of receptive field expansion to bring activity up to the minimum. So what's happened? A population has been created that somewhat resembles the population that would have been created if the actual event had been experienced. But of course there's little related activity in the cortical areas close to sensory input. So there's a subjective experience similar in some ways to remembering an actual event. But it hasn't got the sensory level, so it's not a visual hallucination. But furthermore, the receptive field expansions in the more complex areas can provide a basis for recalling having imagined the event. So you can actually remember having imagined it. We're pretty good at distinguishing between the memory for a real event and the memory of an imaginary event. We can generally tell if we experienced an event directly or only read about it, for example. And there are a couple of factors which can be the basis for these distinctions. First, the recall of a real event has somewhat less receptive field detection in the areas close to sensory inputs than at the time of the experience. But the recall of an event that was only imagined in the first place could have even less activity in those simpler cortical areas. And secondly, for a real memory, once the receptive fields making up the recall have been activated, indirect activation of other receptive fields on the basis of receptive field expansion just a little bit later in time than the fields that have been recalled will result in recall of later circumstances in the same event. But for an imagined event, the population activated on this basis may include sensory circumstances unrelated to the imagining, such as the book or magazine that created the imagining, or an environment such as sitting at home where the imagining took place, completely different from the imagined environment in which the imagined event took place. So the lack of receptive field activation close to sensory inputs, plus the inability to activate fully consistent populations on the basis of expansions a little bit later, make it possible to identify recalls of imaginary events.